Hi everybody, thank you for joining us today. My name is Tracy Costley and I am a linguist at the University of Essex, and welcome to this series of talks by Aberin Albibo, a linguist online, which is an initiative of the Brazilian Linguistics Association. Hi everybody, thank you for joining us today. My name is Tracy Costley and I am a linguist. Just one moment. Sorry about that. So today it is my pleasure to introduce my good friend and colleague, Dr. Hannah Gibson. Hannah is a senior lecturer at the Department of Language and Linguistics at the University of Essex. Her research is concerned with linguistic variation, particularly why and how languages change. Much of her work explores the syntax and semantics of the Bantu languages, with a focus on languages spoken from Eastern and Southern Africa. She's also interested in language and identity, language use in urban contexts, and the relationship between linguistics and social justice. And today, Hannah's talk is entitled Multilingual Classroom Practices, Teacher Pressures and Realities. And in this, she'll be talking about a Global Challenges Research Fund project that's funded by the British Academy and which explores language practices in classrooms in Tanzania, Zambia and Botswana. So it'll be an interesting presentation. There will be time at the end for questions, so please feel free to post any questions you have in the chat and we will answer those for you. So I will now hand over to Hannah and we'll join you again for the discussion. So Hannah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tracy, for the introduction, and of course thanks very much to Erling for the invitation to be here. So I will just share my slides and get started. So yeah, as Tracy mentioned in the introduction, the title of the talk, Multilingual Classroom Practices, Teacher Pressures and Reality. So we'll have a chance to look a little bit more at that. I will say that this is very much based on joint work with colleagues who you will find out a bit more about in the course of the project. So introduction and background. So yeah, individual and societal multilingualism is a key aspect of the linguistic reality of many African countries. So not all African countries, but lots of the countries in Africa have multilingualism. Both there are multilingual individuals and multilingualism on the sort of national and societal level. And in terms of what I'm going to be talking about today, there's this kind of idea of language policy. So if you think about multilingualism, essentially on some level, it implies a choice of language use. And language policy is often concerned with managing this choice at different levels. So managing individuals' language choice, but communities, national, and different contexts of language use. And it won't be surprising that a key area in which this plays out is in education. So learners and communities have diverse needs and resources are often inequitably distributed. And so we're interested in how this plays out and links to multilingualism in the African context. Again, just by way of a bit more background, so there's increasing evidence, and I mean, this has been known for a while, but there's increasingly robust evidence on the benefits of so-called mother tongue multilingual education. So both sort of large international organizations and research by individual scholars showing that there are real benefits of, particularly in early years, learners having access to education in a language that is familiar to them and ideally a sort of first or one of their first languages. Despite that, we also see a growth in the use of English in particular as a medium of instruction across the world and also at various levels of education. So today I'm going to be focusing on primary education, but actually we see this across all levels of education as well. Still with this kind of broader context in mind, I think this number is quite sort of striking really. 40% of the global population does not have access to education in a language that they speak or understand. Again, this is research from UNESCO. So really a very, very large percentage of the world don't have access to education in a language which they're really able to engage with education in. And similarly, monolingual policies, and we'll return to that idea, which do not accurately reflect the linguistic reality of people's lives, can have huge consequences. Specifically, they can inhibit access to health, education, which is the focus here, but also political and economic systems. So it won't be sort of surprising that not being able to engage in these systems, if the language in which you're expected to do that is not one that you have sort of strong control of. So in this talk, I'm going to be presenting emerging findings from a collaborative project that looks at language and education policies with a focus on Tanzania, Zambia, and Botswana. Here I'm going to focus on the attitudes and experiences of teachers. So there could be many talks focusing on the experience of learners, pupils, community members, parents, policy, but here I'm just going to be focusing really on teachers, but again, we will see the views of others. And really we want to consider the multiple pressures that operate on teachers, but also the skills used to navigate these multi-factorial sort of pressures. And then towards the end, I want to make a few sort of recommendations or highlight avenues for support, training, and also conversations about teachers and language policy. So like making sure that we can think about the role of teachers in these contexts. So just a little overview of the talk. So this is an introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit about the project, just so you know who we are and what we're doing. I'm going to set a little bit of the kind of methodological background and introduce notions of translanguaging, and we're adopting a linguistic ethnographic approach, so I'll talk about that. And then I'm going to focus in on the 3 countries that we're working in, looking at the language and education policies, and then present some of these emerging findings of the project. And then some kind of summary and conclusions, and again, those next steps, where from here. Okay, so I think as Tracy said in the introduction, this is the results of the research I'm presenting here, are part of an ongoing project called Bringing the Outside In, merging local language and literacy practices to enhance classroom learning and achievement. And we're really fortunate to have the funding for the project from the Global Challenges Research Fund via the British Academy. It was initially a 2-year project. We got a bit of an extension due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, so it's now going to be going on until next year. And really the aim of the project is to examine the ways in which multilingual practices can be harnessed, right? The sort of benefits of multilingual practices for learners in education. And as the title perhaps suggests, we're particularly interested in the link, but also the disconnect between the practices you see in communities, so multilingual practices in the communities, and that's what we consider to be the outside essentially, and practices inside the classroom. So what is going on and how are they different and similar? So this is our overview of our team. We have a photo here from our first project meeting in Zambia, actually now 2 years ago. But there's 4 of us based at the University of Essex. So Nancy Kula, Tracy Costley, myself, and our postdoctoral researcher, Colin Riley. And then at the University of Botswana, the project lead is Mompoloki Bahwasi, who's sitting in the middle here with the hat on in the photo. And she has 2 fantastic research assistants, Dikosha and Petso, who are working with her. At the University of Dar es Salaam, the project lead is Gaston Mapunda, who's sitting in the photo, and he's closest to us, near the bottle of water, who's working again with 2 research assistants, Edna and Salvatore. And then at the University of Zambia, the project lead is Joseph Mwansa, who again has 2 research assistants, Martha and Cheleshi. And the broader questions that the project is seeking to examine are these. We've sort of got these 3 key research projects that were guiding the research questions guiding the project. So asking really what language and literacy practices are promoted, valued and expected in schools, and similarly what language and literacy practices are promoted, valued and expected outside schools. So you can see the contrast between the inside and the outside here. And then we're interested in how translanguaging pedagogies and practices could be developed in schools to enhance this teaching and learning experiences. And I'll come back to that shortly as well. So just a little bit more about this kind of conceptual background and some of the methodological approach as well. So really thinking about the invention of language and invention of languages. So here we have a quote from Makoni and Pennycook, and a few others as well, working down the slide. But languages were, and in the most literal sense, invented, particularly as part of the Christian or / colonial project. And here really encouraging us to think, or to try and stop thinking about languages as these kind of bounded entities, which are kind of cordoned off, and an individual uses one particular language, thinking about the history of being able to name or label a language, The idea here that in this case, Africa, a continent without languages, perhaps a sort of helpful way of thinking of this is not that people don't communicate and talk to each other, but perhaps having multiple languages and multiple linguistic repertoires available to them, a toolkit of different languages that can be used. And again, here the final point, Christian missionaries had been active as early as the 16th century in preparing word lists and grammatical descriptions of the languages of the conquered people in European colonial empires. So again, really this sort of invention of language, people either through descriptive work, but also in terms of just labeling and naming, thinking about, okay, that is our language, that is a language. And you'll see later on that this has implications for education, that this has implications for language policy and decisions that have been made. So if that was the invention of language, then we can also talk about disinventing language. So language classification has been a construct to control variety and difference, and thus excludes mixed language practices, creoles, and other ways of using languages in multilingual networks. So again, trying to move away from that idea that you have a language that is bounded and sort of distinct, but thinking actually about many speakers and many people who have multiple languages at their disposal. Again, the final sort of conceptual idea here, languages do not exist as real entities in the world, neither do they emerge from or represent real environments. They are, by contrast, the inventions of social, cultural, and political movements. So again, trying to sort of encourage us not to think of these things as neutral and not to think of them as real, but really as constructs and as constructed. So we are adopting and sort of interested in translanguaging. So here, just to kind of introduce a little bit about that and what that means. And again, this is a kind of a perspective on taking translanguaging perspective. So translanguaging represents an epistemic shift from traditional theorizations of bilingualism. And again, this is the same as the invention, as two separate bounded language systems. So trying to move away from the idea that a person has two languages which don't interact, and they're separate sort of two separate bounded languages. I will say here, we're less concerned with translanguaging as an analytical tool for describing specific examples of language use. So we're not sort of saying, okay, that is language A, that is language B, oh, now they're back into language A. But rather it's encouraging us to sort of fundamentally think about how we view what language is languaging. And again, as a sort of epistemological approach or perspective, translanguaging foregrounds the idea that classification, enumeration, naming languages is essentially arbitrary and ideologically motivated. So keeping that at the back of our minds when we think about multilingual practices and what that might mean. So thinking now a little bit about more pedagogy, right? So we're interested in education. Translanguaging pedagogy seeks to create a heteroglossic, inclusive space for all learners to draw upon their full linguistic repertoires to acquire, understand, and demonstrate knowledge. And here I think key ideas are like the inclusive space and for all learners. So again, recognizing the power of language and the power of decisions that are made relating to language in terms of access, inclusion, and equality. And again, bilingualism or multilingualism being acknowledged as a resource. So with a focus here on teachers and education, teachers strategically incorporate students' cultural and linguistic funds of knowledge in academic tasks. So rather than thinking, oh, don't speak like that, leave that language there, don't talk in that language when you're in this context, teachers, educators are encouraged to actually see this as a huge source of wealth, linguistic funds of knowledge, which can be employed in academic tasks and indeed support learning more broadly. So our project is adopting a linguistic ethnographic approach. So this is a kind of interpretive approach which studies crucially local and immediate actions of actors from their point of view and considers how these interactions are embedded in wider social contexts and structures. So really trying to, as far as possible, understand actions in context and also from that actor's perspectives rather than sort of observing from a distance. And here we have a quote from Unamuno, who says the study of multilingualism in institutional settings needs to be carried out from an ethnographic perspective. So again, our institutions here are education, crucially primary education. We have in our project some work that was a paper that was written by Tracy Costley and Colin Riley, who have developed these 3 principles for linguistic ethnography. This was developed during the course of the project, and very much encourage people to read the paper. I just want to introduce these briefly because they are, again, crucial to how we're working as a project. Conducting linguistic ethnography multilingually, collaboratively, and responsively. I won't spend and go into too much detail on these, but just noting really that we are conducting research on multilingualism multilingually, and noticing that lots of research on multilingualism is still itself done monolingually. So in our data collection, in our analysis, in discussing and sharing data, in our meetings, we encourage multilingual practices within our research team, certainly encouraging people to use languages other than English. And here we say English because this is, across all project members, our common language. And those of us who are based in the UK, where they're sort of speaking in English with each other, but encouraging the use of multilingual practices in our research, where appropriate, ensuring that we put English last. And one of the things we have to acknowledge there is we won't understand everything that happens. So we won't understand everything that everyone else says or writes or shares. And sometimes that's uncomfortable, but that is okay, an inevitable part of taking this type of approach. Researching collaboratively, sort of perhaps in itself sort of explanatory, recognizing that this ethnographic work is not an individual, but has to be a group effort, and our collaborators, thinking about them broadly. So there's the research team, but also the participants in the project, the community, anyone who is involved, anyone we talk to, and that working collaboratively, we're able to obtain a deeper understanding of the context. So it's not an individualistic approach. And their final principle, researching responsively. So we're not restrained by a strict set of research practices or rules. We can be, and in fact, have to be flexible and adapt. And also in terms of the thematic sort of approach and the topics, being prepared to respond to these as they emerge during the research. What is of interest to us, what's of interest to our collaborators, not setting out with a predefined set of questions that we want to answer, but being open-minded and prepared to look at that. So now a little bit more of a sort of regional focus now. I'm going to talk about the 3 countries where we're conducting this research, and the kind of broader language and education policies in each of the countries. So across much of Africa in the kind of post-independence era, so really 1960s onwards, nationwide and also crucially national unity were very much equated with monolingualism. So this was perhaps also influenced and inspired by some of the monolingual approaches that were taken in Europe and other parts of the world. But there was very much an idea that if you were building a newly independent country and bringing together lots of people who have different backgrounds and different languages, that one of the key ways of forming some kind of nation and ensuring national unity would be to have a monolingual approach. And this has been written about extensively. As a result, the vast majority of African countries adopted a single official language. So many countries were choosing between a language of a former colonial power and other languages, but the vast majority of countries chose one single language. More recently, in sort of present day, obvious exceptions would, for example, be South Africa with 11 official languages. But thinking about sort of multilingualism versus monolingualism, not that it was the same language, but it was our language that was chosen. And naturally, this fed into language in education policies. So what language would be used in classrooms, what language would be used to teach. So we have, the project is based in and conducting research in 3 countries. So one of them is Botswana, and to provide you with a kind of broader context in Botswana, numbers of sort of calculations vary, but there's something like 25 to 28 languages spoken in Botswana. The official language is English, and the national language is Setswana. And this is a kind of concept and a distinction that we'll see throughout the presentation. So there is an official language, which is English, the language of former colonial rule. 78% of the population in Botswana report speaking Setswana at home. So this national language is spoken not only by a large proportion of the population, but is spoken at home by a large proportion of the population. So thinking about what that means in terms of, yes, not just that you can speak Setswana, but this is your language of home, it's the language you speak with your family. We also note here that this is reported. So of course people may, and this is interesting again for this research, say, oh yes, I speak Setswana at home, but they may speak other languages at home as well, right? So sort of self-reporting notoriously only captures part of the story. One of the other things to note here is that there's severe language endangerment. Many languages of Botswana are highly endangered, and of course there are some which are, as far as we know, extinct as well. So you have a relatively small number of languages compared to some of the other countries we're looking at, but a large, numerically large and numerically dominant language in Setswana, with English as the official language. Just to think a little bit about the language and education policy now, so schooling. The kind of most recent kind of official policy from the government stated that in primary school, English should be used as the medium of instruction from standard 2, or as soon as practical. It's quite notable that this leaves quite a lot open to interpretation. So you could say, well, actually, it should be even before standard 2, sort of very, very early on, so it's the second year of school, second grade, so standard 2, or as soon as practical, and then people are left to think about exactly what that means. I'm going to do the same for Zambia and Tanzania. So Zambia, slightly more languages, and again, there's approximately 30 languages or dialect clusters. Actually, some people put the number in the 70s if they chop up the numbers, the languages or the dialects into separate languages. Again, we have official language as English. So this parallels the situation in Botswana. Zambia has a separate sort of system, a different kind of status, languages with different status. Zambia has 7 national languages. So you have official languages English, and then you have these 7 national languages which are based on regions. So Bemba, Nyanja, Lozi, Tonga, Konde, Luvale, and Lunda. Depending on where you are in the country, you will be in an area with Bemba, for example, as one of the national languages. Of course, here you can see that that's still misses out some of the, even if you have a sort of relatively low estimate of the number of languages and say 30, there are these 7 that are somehow given this additional status of national language. The Zambia Education Curriculum Framework states that in preschool up to grade 4, so preschool, the very young ones, when they're just starting up to grade 4, teaching is to be in what's called a familiar Zambian language. What this means in practice is that in many areas you have one of these regional or national languages as the medium of instruction. So depending on where you are in the country, you will have one of these national languages as your medium of instruction from preschool up to grade 4. English is taught as a subject, or pupils are taught English from grade 2, although initially they're taught it orally, and then from grade 3 onwards they're taught written English as well. And then here from grade 5 onwards, English is the medium of instruction, and these national languages may be subjects. So your schooling now is conducted, or your education is conducted in English, but you learn Bemba or Nyanja in the same way as you learn maths or chemistry or something like that. So we've seen the situation in Botswana and Zambia, and our third context is Tanzania. So Tanzania, of our countries in the project, has the largest number of languages. So there's approximately 150 languages spoken across the country. The official language is Swahili. So Tanzania was the only country to choose an African language as its official language at independence. We will sort of come back to that in the course of the discussion. This also means that the other languages have no official platform or status. So in contrast to Zambia, where you have regional languages, Tanzania has Swahili as the official language, and then the other languages which are not sort of used in, for example, education, or not supposed to be used in education or media, and so on. In Tanzania, the education and training policy states that Swahili is the medium of instruction in government primary schools. Private primary schools may have English as the medium of instruction. So private primary schools are allowed to have English as a medium of instruction, but the government primary schools, the sort of standard national policy is for Swahili to be the medium of instruction. Interestingly, at secondary school onwards, and this includes colleges, vocational colleges and universities, English is the medium of instruction. So I presented here a sort of a snapshot of the languages in the country, the sort of various statuses of languages, and then I've just presented a snapshot of the sort of language in education policies in each case. And we'll see a little bit more about the implications of this. I just want to draw out the similarities between the three countries. So all three countries have monoglossic language policies. They all essentially say this one language is the official language. This one language is the language you're supposed to use in grade, whether it's preschool to grade 2, preschool to grade 4, primary education, they all choose one language. Yes, Zambia has these national languages, but nowhere does the policy say use all 7. It says in this area use 1, in this area use this one. They all also ultimately have English dominant approaches. So this is most clear in Botswana and Zambia, where English is the official language. But even in Tanzania, you have Swahili in primary education, but English in secondary education. And there is a sort of implicit assumption there that as you get into more complicated subjects, as your education sort of extends to higher levels, then you will need to use English for that. So really, even taking Swahili as your primary school language of education, you have English dominant approaches. Sort of beyond language specifically, all countries also adopt a system of centralization where government workers are posted to different regions and teachers are government employees. So this means that teachers are posted to areas where they're not from, either by chance or in some cases deliberately, and as a result do not necessarily speak the local language or languages. So of course it depends how long they're there for, where they're from, what languages they have. But it is not the case that a teacher who speaks Lozi will be sent to a school in a Lozi area, for example. Other similarities are that in all three countries, there is a point at which the language, the medium of instruction switches. At some point, it changes. I'm just going to talk briefly about the differences because that is one of them. The only sort of key kind of difference here, and I've hinted slightly at this, is you have this kind of dominant national language versus regional language situation. So in Zambia, where you are in the country makes a difference. You don't have that in Botswana and Tanzania, where it's kind of one system for the whole country. And the switch in medium of instruction happens at different stages. So in both Zambia and Botswana, the switch in medium of instruction happens in primary school. So whether it's grade 2 or grade 4, it happens within primary education. In Tanzania, the switch in medium of instruction happens between primary and secondary. So all of your primary education is in Swahili. If you go to a government school or state school, all your secondary education is in English. So there's this kind of crucial point of switch in medium of instruction. So I just want to kind of summarize and bring together the various points that I've presented so far, and then I'm going to move on to talk about some of our data and some of the insights from teachers, community members, and pupils. So our project adopts this linguistic ethnographic approach to explore issues in education in Tanzania, Botswana, and Zambia, these three countries. We're interested in the differences between language practices in the community, so that's our outside, and in formal classroom spaces. That's the inside. I do acknowledge here that education takes place in lots of different contexts, and there are different sort of ways in which learning happens. So that's why I have the idea of a formal classroom, really talking about kind of formal education through primary schooling systems, basically. All three countries are multilingual in different ways and to different extents, but have all essentially adopted monolingual dominant language and education policies. So now I want to talk a little bit about our emerging findings. And I say emerging because this is an ongoing project, so we might find other things as we go along. And as I said at the outset, really focusing on teachers. So in Tanzania, the data that I'm presenting here were gathered in two areas. So Ruvuma region, Remembering that Tanzania has quite a lot of languages, I've said 150. Ngoni is the dominant language in the area where the data were gathered, and the other data collection site was Tabora, where Sukuma is the dominant language in the area where the data were gathered. So the data are collected in different areas with different kind of dominant languages of the wider community. 10 schools were visited. I'll just show a snapshot of some observations and interviews. And in both places, as in the whole of Tanzania, Swahili use is widespread. So Swahili is very much the language of wider communication. It's the primary language of primary education. So just have a range of quotes. I don't want to read them all out, but what I've done is sort of highlight key kind of ideas and themes that come out. So these data were collected in Swahili. So we have the Swahili and then we have the English translation as well. So here what we have is teachers' attitudes, or some excerpts of teachers' attitudes. And one teacher here notes that many pupils do not know Swahili. The consequences of this is that they cannot get the expected knowledge. So there is a recognition here and acknowledgement that not knowing Swahili when children enter school, right? So they speak Ngoni at home, they speak Sukuma at home, they speak whatever the language of the wider community is or their home language. And they get to primary school and teaching is conducted in Swahili. This is essentially a barrier to getting the knowledge, right? So if they're being taught to read or they're being taught maths, this is seen as a sort of a challenge. Another teacher notes that in beginner classes, and so these are those first few years of primary education, they suggest that both languages should be used. So the idea being that to kind of encourage and support the pupil to go from whatever language it is they speak at home to they arrive at school and Swahili is suddenly the language, they suggest using both of those languages side by side to facilitate that kind of knowledge, facilitate them getting that knowledge that schooling is aiming for. Another sort of view from teachers, so thinking still about the teacher attitudes, the teacher here notes that in some places the policy is not observed. So the policy says that primary education is to be conducted in Swahili. But here again, similar to what we saw on the previous slide, the teacher notes the aim is for the children to get knowledge, right? They're at school to learn not just Swahili, but learn something. So here they say this forces teachers to not abide by the national policy by using what are called here ethnic languages in their teaching. So here the idea being that, okay, to get whatever the material is, the content of this teaching, we need to use these other languages. And here, actually, this is an extract from another area, Mbulu, where one of the dominant languages is Iraq. The teacher is basically saying, actually, we're going to have to use that language to facilitate the teaching. This teacher actually notes, and I haven't highlighted that here, I would advise that the policy is revised and that the use of ethnic languages be allowed. So sort of acknowledging this idea that, okay, the policy says you should use Swahili, but the reality is that many of the pupils coming into school do not speak Swahili, and how are we going to teach them what we're there and supposed to be teaching them? Now thinking about, so we have interviews and focus group sort of data from parents, carers, community members, sort of groups. We were interested in what their thoughts were as well. And again, you see very similar things to what the teachers were saying. So here we have a community member who says, but if the teacher starts directly using Swahili, the children will be slow to understand. So there's this idea that on one hand, kids are going to school to learn something, but the language that is being used to, the language that's being used to instruct, the medium of instruction, Swahili, if it's used straight from the sort of outset, then the children will struggle to sort of learn and things will be slowed down. And the suggestion in the next highlighted section is they should mix Swahili and Sukuma so that they understand properly. So again, here, basically community members advocating for at least a bilingual and possibly a multilingual approach, in the knowledge that, okay, this is going to be hard. These students don't speak this language. They arrive at school, they've got a lot to learn. We suggest essentially a multilingual approach. As always, it's much more complicated and messy than that. So we have other community members saying it's impossible to use Sukuma. So this contrasts with the previous quote, here only Swahili can be used. Now here, not only is this person saying, no, we should use Swahili, the reason is, they say, is because the teachers here come from different places and some don't know Sukuma. So the classes can only be in the national language, they can only be used in Swahili. So this person's concern is not necessarily for the impact on, Swahili makes it difficult for the students to learn, but the practical reality is that even if we said, okay, teach in Sukuma, not all of the teachers will know Sukuma, which is the language that the children know, because they come from different places. So you have a real consideration of practical issues here as well. Again, a different community member now says, kids come straight from home and they get to school, they meet Swahili, you'll see that teachers don't know what to do and they're struggling. So you're thinking about this experience as a young person who's just started school, they're struggling, the kids are struggling, but I still think they should start directly with Swahili. Their sort of home languages should be left at home. And we don't kind of get that unpacked here, but perhaps also acknowledging that, well, ultimately they're going to have to learn Swahili. So why not start from the very beginning? So just kind of a bit of a summary, but this actually comes from a classroom observation. So those were presentations from focus groups and interviews. This is people sort of telling you directly what happens. Observation of classroom in these places in Tanzania this is conducted not by myself, but by our colleagues. Teachers exclusively use Swahili when teaching. So the teachers were talking in Swahili when they're teaching. Learners used both Swahili and Ngoni in class. So this is the Ngoni speaking area. They noticed that they use Ngoni when whispering or asking each other questions, seeking clarification, sit next to someone, they speak Ngoni amongst themselves. When responding to teachers' questions, the learners almost always respond in the language used by the teacher, and that is Swahili. The teacher insists on the use of Swahili when the students respond, but the teacher does not interfere with or react at all with the language with which the students carry out discussions amongst themselves. So if the kids are speaking Ngoni to each other, the teacher doesn't interfere. But when the pupils are speaking to the teacher insists on the use of Swahili. So these are the kind of practices that were observed. So that's from Tanzania. I'm going to do a similar thing from Botswana and Zambia, presenting sort of slightly different data in each case. And then I'm going to bring out the kind of key themes from all three places. So in Botswana here, we're presenting data from two places, Molepolole, where a couple of schools were visited. The predominant language in this area is Setswana. This is a village about 60 kilometers from Gaborone, so the capital of Botswana. And then there's Lathakeng, where the predominant language in the area is Shegalahadi. So this place is 120 kilometers from Gaborone, a bit further away, and a different language of the wider community. And again, the data collected here are from Petso and Dikosha, our research assistants in Botswana, under our colleague Mompoloki Barasi's supervision. Just have a few photos here. So we have some focus groups, and I've got some photos from inside the classrooms as well. So this is one of our research assistants with some of the pupils or children essentially taking part in the research, sitting around and talking, and just have some photos from inside the classrooms. And this is to kind of give you a visual representation. Interestingly, to see the languages used side by side. So on the left here, we have words in English and Setswana. And I think it's interesting that at the top here, this says translation. So you have the English word for girl, and then you have the Setswana word on the right-hand side. And you see that in a few of the other things. So the photo on the right, we also have the word for winter, the word for Tuesday, with English and Setswana side by side. And similar things in other cases. So the days of the week, English and Setswana. For the environmental science board on the left, you might not be able to see the details. Here we don't have any English at all. So we have pictures, and then we have the Setswana words for different parts of, so it's animals and things like that. So in terms of the classroom practices, what I'm doing out here is drawing out actually some of the data, language use in the classrooms. So here you have this is a teacher, and then you have the students. And a teacher here in this class is looking for an action word, right? A doing word, a verb. The teacher, so you can see the teacher is speaking in English. So I want an action word, just one word. And a student says cooking, and the teacher says cooking, very good. Cooking, yes, Serafina, what? Anyone else? Student says walking. Interestingly, the teacher now, the bits that are highlighted in yellow are Setswana. So the teacher says in Setswana, I can't hear you. And the student again says walking, presumably louder. And then you can tell this is a recent piece of data. The teacher says, remove your mask so I can hear you. And the student says walking, okay, yes. So here we have a multilingual classroom, right? We have a classroom where at least we have Setswana and English being used. Again, similar sort of thing we see from a teacher. So the teacher starting in English, what are they doing? What are they holding? What can you say about them? And then the teacher perhaps, now this is interesting because the teacher perhaps acknowledges that the students are struggling because they are not confident answering in English. So the teacher actually says explicitly, just say it in Setswana, I will correct you, right? So not just say it in Setswana and I will tell you the English word, but I will correct you. So that's quite interesting as well. And then they're asking more questions, Here again, the bit highlighted below, the teacher is talking, begins in Setswana and then says, so in English, we're going to say, student says, the holding firewood. Teacher says, yes. And then the student continues in Setswana. So these are just examples. So the lower examples are examples of exactly this multilingual practice in a sentence, translanguaging, where you have a teacher using English and Setswana. The classroom is using multiple languages. The example at the top, an acknowledgement, an explicit acknowledgement that perhaps the pupils don't feel comfortable speaking English. Just say it in Setswana, and I'll correct you. I'll tell you what it should have been. Which is what in English? So again, explicitly the teacher trying to draw out from the student, okay, you've given me an answer, kika, okay, but what is kika in English? What is it in English? And then one of the students does come up with the word, oh, it's a mortar. Very good, very good. And then interestingly, they do the other way around. A pestle, okay, what's a pestle? And the teacher says, pestle, which is what in Setswana? And they all then give the Setswana answer as well. So here we have explicit mention of English and Setswana, and we have actually much more like a translation. What is kika in English? You know, what is this word in the other language? But showing that teachers and learners have access to several languages and that these are being employed. This is a similar, so the teacher says, I want a word that starts with D, an English word. Yes, D, you know, anything, and a student says tonki. And then the teacher says, well, do we say donkey in English? Who can help them? And then another student says donkey, yes, D is for donkey. And then the teacher again explicitly says, we're in an English lesson. So if you have to say an answer, you must say it in English, don't say it in Setswana. That's an interesting sort of separate point here, right? So the teacher is saying, well, this is an English lesson. So talking about drawing and delimiting, this is a lesson in which you're supposed to be using English. Not perhaps, you know, you're at school, but a very clear kind of delimitation of when English is supposed to be being used. These are now from focus groups and interviews and discussion. So the pupil in the Botswana context says, when we do not understand in English, we simply ask that they explain it to us in Setswana. So this seems to be okay, right? And they know, okay, I don't understand English, but the teacher will explain it in Setswana if I need them to. Again, you know, pupil sort of says something like, oh, well, you know, we're not forced. And the people say, well, what do others say? Oh, no, we're not forced. So here the suggestion being, you know, that in the discussion, so our research assistant asks, you know, are you forced to answer in English or speak Setswana in school or in the classroom? And the people say, no, we're not forced. You know, we're not forced to speak that, you know, suggesting that they have a choice. And a sort of similar thing here, you know, are you forced to answer or speak in English or Setswana? The student actually says English. It's in, you know, we're forced to speak in English. And again, Pedso says, you're forced to speak in English, and the student says, yes, ma'am, yeah, we are. So some people saying, no, we're not forced to speak in English or Setswana, we have the choice, the freedom. Here, a different student saying, yes, we're kind of forced and expected to answer in English. And what happens if you don't answer in English? So a student says, okay, I speak Setswana, And Betso says, oh, you speak Setswana? And the student says, yes. What if you speak Shogalahadi? What if you speak your own language? And the student says, she or he beats me. So here, on one hand, we have a suggestion that we're free to speak whichever language we want. But this is now an area where students speak a different language. So this is not Setswana, this is Shogalahadi. And if you don't speak Setswana and you don't speak English, but you speak a different language, the student says, the teacher beats me. So even, not to present a too rosy picture from the previous excerpts of like, oh, there's freedom and flexibility and the students can speak whichever language they want, this student reports this not to be the case. And we have similar data from Tanzania, which I haven't presented here as well. Broader community attitudes, right? So these are parents and the community more widely. Again, this is from the Shogalahadi speaking area. So people are saying, okay, well, this is where, if you had a choice, which language do you want your child to learn in? And the parent says, my mother tongue language, which is this language Shogalahadi of the area. So not Setswana, not the national language, and not English, the official language. And trying to understand why that might be. The parent says, because he or she understands the language and I also understand it very well. So recognizing in practical terms, the pupil understands this language. That's why I want them to be taught in that language at school. And as a parent, in this case, I would also be able to understand what was going on because I also understand it very well. Again, these are just about sort of understanding. So showing really that parents and community members do really have this idea of, well, we want our children to understand what's going on. Learners do not understand, or we want them to be able to understand better. So it's not just about you must know language X, but this great awareness of the point of going to school being to learn things and understand what's going on. If subjects are taught in English, for example, they're not necessarily going to understand. This again, sort of showing what happens when you have another language in the area. So this is also Shogalahadi area, and the respondent says, oh, it can be used. It's our language, and saying, well, what would why should it be used? Why would you like this language to be used? And they say, well, it's our language. But also, if a child struggles with a Setswana word, then they can say it in Shogalahadi. So actually, we want our children to be able to use the language that they know well and to be able to express themselves. And if they're struggling with a word in a language they don't know, then they get to say it in the language they do know. I think I'll just skip this one. This is about English and Setswana. So Setswana is very difficult for them. This is not the language they speak at home. Here, interestingly, a parent or community member again says all languages should be promoted. And now in the Botswanan context, there's also Ikalanga, for example, and other languages. So recognizing that it's not just a conflict or kind of challenge to choose which one of two languages, but that there are multiple languages. And here, this is important. A lot of the motivation for this, why I'm happy to learn English and why do we want to know English? Because for one to find a job, you need to know English. So here in awareness, I mean, we're talking about primary education, but thinking about, well, if I want my child to have a job after school eventually, then English is the way to access that. So here we have these kind of conflicting pressures, wanting our children to understand, wanting to know what's going on in school. We have pride in our own home languages, but the practical considerations of being able to get employment after school means you need to know or want to know English. Just going to do the same for Zambia in a few minutes, and then I'll bring it all together. So we have data from two areas in Zambia. So Kasama, which is in so-called Northern Province, and Nakonde, which is in Muchinga Province. So Kasama is a predominantly Bemba-speaking area, but there's more multilingualism in the urban areas because it's the provincial headquarters. And Nakonde is a predominantly Namwanga-speaking area. I will sort of explain that as we go along, but crucially, Bemba is the medium of instruction for the first 4 years in both. So Namwanga doesn't have national language status in Zambia, Bemba does. So in these two areas, although at one area, most pupils will be Bemba speaking at home, and another area they will not, they're taught in Bemba in both places. So here again, teachers' attitudes, experiences and realities. So the teacher saying, okay, well, All the books are in Bemba. This is the regional language. It's the national language we're supposed to teach in. So we teach in Bemba, but there are words in Bemba we have challenges with. So we're forced to switch to Namwanga to make them understand. But all in all, it's Bemba. So in both of these places, Bemba is supposed to be the media instruction, but the teachers are switching to Namwanga to help the learners understand what's going on. And again, this idea of understanding. So for them to capture, sort of understand what we're talking about, well, it takes time because most of the pupils are Namwanga speaking. They don't speak Bemba at home. They come to school and we're talking in Bemba. Of course, it's going to take them a while to get what's going on. Here we have some nice, and actually in these interviews, we have some nice translanguaging within them. So that one depends on the teacher teaching, right? So again, not all of the teachers are going to speak Namwanga. So here they say there's a language barrier. So if it's a Bemba speaking teacher, they can't necessarily switch to Namwanga. So some of them really go through grade 1, right? They go through that whole year of school without really knowing what's going on. They have a pretty tough time. But that's showing that it depends, on the linguistic repertoire of the teacher as well. Again, focus on sort of understanding. Okay, do you think children understand the language used in the classroom? They do not understand it very well. So, the language is a challenge, it's a barrier to their understanding. And here, again, at home, we just speak Namwanga, right? That's all you'll find. We speak Namwanga, that's our area, that's our language. You find they do not write with understanding, instead they speak Namwanga. So that sort of challenge between, or sort of balance between the language that they speak and understand and the language that's expected in the classroom. Here, this is interesting. You have someone saying, okay, well, if you could change the language of instruction in schools, if you had a choice, if you had the power, what language would you want your children to be taught in? And the parent says, I would allow the use of Namwanga. And then the interviewer says, well, what's the reason you want the children to learn in Namwanga? And the parent says, because this is a Namwanga speaking area. Now, again, that could mean lots of different things, but ultimately our children speak Namwanga when they get to school. That's, what I think they should be taught in. I'll skip that one. That's about home language use. Here we get, so remember that English comes into the picture as well. They should use English or the language used by the teachers, because it doesn't work out well for the children to speak Namwanga and most of their teachers speak Bemba. So again, a recognition of the reality of, okay, it's all very well to say they should use this language, but teachers don't speak that language. They can't. It's not going to be a good situation. The emphasis on jobs and employment again comes back, right? So we want our children to learn English so they can get a job. Interestingly, Namwanga is temporal, right? It's something that sort of you start with and then it's not going to get you very far. But we want our children to learn English so that job hunting will become easier. So this was mirrored in the situation in Botswana as well. English will help my child find many job opportunities, the same kind of idea. English is important. Without it, then you are nothing. So really strong views here about how important English is and is going to be. I just wanted, this is the final sort of excerpt, and I just thought it was a nice one to end on. Well, it's not very nice, but it's an important one to end on. So this is the interview coming to an end, and the person says, well, I don't have anything to add. I just want to thank you for coming, because no one has ever been here to find out from us how our children learn. So here really highlighting, there is this awareness amongst parents, amongst community members, that this is an issue and this is a part of the reality. And here, yes, they're thanking the interviewer, and actually, this is part of a project and we can make recommendations, but acknowledging that I really want people to be aware that we know about this and no one has ever come to ask us. It would be good for the government to be considering this and be concerned. So themes that come out of these 3 different contexts. There's an acknowledgement by both teachers and community members that students have difficulties with the medium instruction in all places. So this was the case in Tanzania with Swahili. It was the case in Botswana, whether it's Setswana or English. And it was the case in Zambia, primarily with Namwanga. That challenge, difficulties with the medium instruction, is seen as some kind of obstacle to acquiring knowledge. So the knowledge being whatever you're supposed to be learning at school. despite that, some did express negative attitudes towards the inclusion of other languages. We haven't seen a lot of that here, but this sort of idea of like, well, if they're going to learn English, they might as well learn English now. They're going to need to learn Setswana at some point, so we don't think they should have multiple languages. But some people also say that using both and actually acknowledging maybe more than 2 languages can be an aid and should be facilitated. So we had that from teachers saying, really, if we just use one, the pupils will be slow to learn. Using a mixture is the only way to really make this work. Other kind of common themes that we saw. So there is a sort of single language approach adopted by most teachers, apart from the student-student classroom talk. So there was very little interference. I don't think we have examples of any, whereas teacher is telling students not to use language X amongst themselves. What the teacher does is directs their language use to the students in a particular way. In the data from Botswana and Zambia, we did have the teachers speaking multiple languages, but for the most part, they're sort of adopting one and saying, you should speak this. Having said that, there's a high level of individual choice and variation, and not all teachers speak local languages. So it depends who the teachers are and the classrooms that you're in and observing as to what they're able to do, never mind what they do. Unsurprisingly, community members consider future prospects and employment when discussing language policy and choices. So even these are primary education, they're talking about jobs. And there's also notions of pride, and the link between language and identity is also noted. So this is a Namwanga speaking area, so we should speak Namwanga. So now I just want to kind of have got some summary and a few sort of not even conclusions, but really further questions. So classroom practices are multilingual to varying degrees. The Tanzanian data, we don't have the children speaking different languages in what I presented here, but that does happen, and we know it from the observation. Regional languages dominate in the classroom, with teachers adhering to language policies in different ways. So that goes back to teacher choice and perhaps not choice if they don't speak one of the local languages. And there is a discrepancy and a disconnect between policy and practice. So what the Botswana government policy is and what the education and learning policy is in Tanzania is, and what is actually happening in these classrooms is different. There is a recognition by all. So we saw that from the teachers and we saw that from the community members and we saw that from the pupils, albeit in a slightly different way, that a monolingual policy approach does not work in practice. The students are slow to learn, it's an obstacle, we have a language barrier. Having said that, there's little consensus on what a suitable alternative might be. So people aren't saying this is what you should do and this would solve all the problems. They recognise that this is messy and actually it's not quite clear what the solution should be. So unsurprisingly, given our approach, and also I think given what the data show, given these sentences, given these exchanges, given these dialogues that we have, the observations, translanguaging could offer a potential solution. And in many ways, we want to suggest that teachers and students already do this in practice. So they are drawing on their full linguistic repertoires inside the classroom to engage and facilitate learning and communication and exchange. And so this allows these to be seen as a resource for learning rather than a barrier. So rather than language being excluded and forced out of the classroom, and the example where you say, oh, this is an English class, you should talk like this, actually lots of these teachers are using whatever available resources they have amongst them all to do as good a job as they can. So we sort of think in terms of next steps and future directions, community support for inclusion for more languages. It would be really nice to sort of see this, and as we say, in many ways this is what's happening. It's just that there are pressures where people feel that you've got to choose between one or two things. What about if the choice was multilingualism rather than should it be language A or language B? Having said that, teachers are, really working under multiple pressures, so their own individual ones, with balancing the needs of the concerns of their role with those of community members. In many ways, they're the implementers of the policy through how they act and how they communicate with the pupils. And they show themselves to be tremendously skillful at doing this. We're interested in the potential for teacher training, considerations of even discussing multilingualism and multilingual classrooms, and perhaps more language supportive pedagogy. So having approaches which acknowledge this multilingual reality and saying, okay, well, how can we have this as supported rather than talking about excluding or only having one language or the other? and also thinking about material support. So there was mention there of our books are in Bemba. There's a nice project being conducted in Rwanda where they have textbooks which are essentially, not only are the textbooks themselves multilingual, but they encourage multilingual interactions. So you will have a picture, for example, and then it says, you know, the task is discuss in Kinyarwanda with your classmates, you know, what's going on here. And in another context, it will be like, well, you know, discuss with the teacher in English, or talk amongst yourselves, and you don't instruct which language should be used, you just leave people to do it. But having resources which acknowledge this and actually support and encourage it, rather than, again, you know, texts that are restrictively monolingual. And again, we acknowledge that translanguaging practices are already being used, even if they don't have formal support. And the question there is, would that and could that make a difference? Does that kind of formal acknowledgement of the multilingual practices and translanguaging, is it needed? And would that then make the difference that we're looking for? The final sort of, really, these are the questions rather than conclusions. So really, we still need to better understand what language skills individuals want to acquire. So on one hand, yes, you may think that to get a job, you need to learn English. But if you are a doctor, and so we have this from Colin Riley's great work in Malawi, if you have a doctor who only speaks English, then actually you won't be able to speak to lots of your patients who aren't English speakers. So on the one hand, you are encouraged to develop a particular linguistic repertoire, and then at some point realize that you needed the repertoire that you had before when you had multiple languages at your disposal. Interesting questions relating to how language provides access to different labour market opportunities, again related to employment and jobs, but not necessarily our language, but languages and that ability to interact with people in different ways. And also thinking about what might need to be done to get multilingual policies on the agenda. So regardless of the policy, whichever policy it was, all of the policies that we talked about, or the three policies that we talk about here, are all ultimately monolingual policies, monolingual dominant policies, which at any one individual stage are assuming one language will be used. So what might we do about that? And I think with that, I just thank you all very much for listening. And of course, thanks to our collaborators on the project and the really wide range of people who've been involved in our focus groups, classroom observations, interviews and discussion, which have fed into this talk and into the project.
Wonderful, thank you, Hannah. And so on behalf of Abraham, thank you, but also personally on behalf of our other project team members, thank you for doing such a fantastic job of representing the work. So we have some really interesting, thank you everybody as well in the chat for interesting comments and questions. So there's a question which I think also links to the many of the things that you've been discussing, or that certainly some of the things that you talked about in terms of where the project is at the moment and kind of sort of looking forward to the next steps. And so one question, and apologies for paraphrasing, I hope I get this close enough to what you were asking. So in a sense of sort of, you know, can we talk a little bit more about how we tackle multilingual education and language maintenance? So in a sense where you've got sort of small multilingual communities. So what do we do, or what might we be able to do in those contexts in a way to kind of push back against sort of more dominant languages? So, you know, where you've got real pressure on speakers of either smaller community languages or smaller language groups, and what might we be able to do there? So I'm just checking that hopefully I've got the question sort of right there. But I don't know if there's anything.
I mean, it's a fantastic question. I mean, we have these kind of, you know, the next steps for the project would also be what do you do practically, right? What are the practical implications of some of what we've talked about here? I think we could perhaps take a step back and think, well, a lot of this almost presents languages in conflict. So you have teachers and parents and actually pupils as well saying, I either have to speak Setswana or English. You know, in this context, I speak English. In this context, I speak Setswana or I speak Shegalahadi. And maybe in that case of smaller communities, but also multilingual communities, actually not just numerically smaller, but, you know, sort of, yeah, perhaps some marginalized communities which are actually very large. If we can step away from thinking of it as a one or the other all the time and actually think about multilingualism as our language, you know, multilingualism as our ways of being, and encourage other people to think in those terms, then I think that would work very well for smaller communities, for marginalized communities, for communities who are, you know, dispersed, all sorts of other ways that people perhaps have less access to some of the centers of power, because a monolingual approach, you know, the majority of the world is multilingual. So it's interesting that in these, you know, in lots of these conversations, the sort of the monolingualism is privileged. And actually, as researchers, as academics, you know, we have a lot of this discussion of, you know, thinking about the ways that we talk about language as, you know, almost as though monolingualism is the ideal. So I think I would sort of, this is less, it's not a practical suggestion, but what I would be calling for almost is a shift away from that, well, certainly a shift away from that, to thinking of multilingualism as the ideal and the reality for lots of people. And then hopefully thinking that then, you know, whichever community you are and the communities, then you're not actually having to push back against those things, because no one is worried that you're multilingual, because that's just more languages. Tracy, I don't know if you've got things to say about that. I was also sort of thinking about this idealized idea of the native speaker, which you know, also have, you know, ideas about and sort of work, but it comes under that same kind of idea of like, well, we should all speak one language natively and that would be the best thing, which, you know, we certainly don't agree with.
No, absolutely, and I think that's absolutely, and in the chat as well, I think all the things you said sort of echo some of the comments there too, and the idea that I think in many contexts, you know, the ones that we looked at, that we're looking at in this project, but also other ones that people are familiar with too, that where, you know, typically what we see and have seen for many years is this sort of odd pressure to take multilingual individuals and essentially turn them into monolingual individuals. And that sort of, there's something very, that's also kind of a bit more complex in terms of around sort of class and often genders and who gets to be multilingual and who is sort of forced more towards these sort of monolinguals. And so in a sense, sort of recognizing speakers capital in that sense as well. And so some sorts of things, what was interesting, I thought, in those pictures as well, where we see the classrooms, you know, are existing as part of a wider linguistic landscape, and the different types of ways in which language is presented there. So it's, you know, on the one hand, it's great that we see the classroom where there's, I think, the Setswana and English being presented, but also as well that would also be an opportunity to have all the other languages of the students, of the community, and to normalize those practices in the same way that they're normalized outside of school. And so in that sense, kind of making that sort of where these, and some of the things that we've been talking about within our project as well, of that sort of sense of where things are bounded and sort of the boundaries that exist around people and how we might be able to perhaps disrupt some of those. So, you know, taking kind of advantage of or to recognizing what the external pressures are and sort of seeing with different ways in the classrooms where we might be able to address some of those things. And one of the comments also as well kind of links to ideas about fairness and how do we approach multilingualism in a way that's fair. And I think, you know, that's a really interesting point too, isn't it? So, you know, we often get, you know, there's often really complex discussions happening around that too, but, you know, if we're sort of moving towards not only policies, but particularly kind of practices that are pedagogies that are supportive of language, but also sort of sensitive to language as well, and one in which, you know, the end goal isn't a multilingual one, but rather sort of seeing those the students in the classrooms with all of their resources and how to mobilize those, because then hopefully then with this sort of concerted effort that then is empowering for other members of the community to be able to say, actually, this is, you know, we want to be able to do these things with our other resources. So yeah, it certainly is an ongoing project, isn't it? There's also another comment here about in response to some of the discussion about this idea of how we respond in smaller communities against sort of larger ideologies or larger pressures, but then also the idea around sort of decolonized countries, and this idea of facing how we face sort of dominant languages, and kind of what might be happening in those specific contexts as well around kind of decoloniality. So I don't know if that's something as well that you might want to, if there's anything you wanted to mention in relation to that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I only mentioned it very briefly in passing about Tanzania declaring an African language as its official language at independence. And you could on one hand sort of say, like, okay, an African country chose an African language as its official language, and thinking about decoloniality, and in contrast to at least the two other countries we present here, which chose English, and many other countries with English and French, Portuguese, and to a much lesser extent Spanish. But the risk there is that Swahili is also the first language of a very small percentage of people in Tanzania, at least historically and traditionally, and in many ways linked to, like you say, class and sort of socioeconomic opportunity. So you are still having a language which ultimately is sort of imposed on vast swathes of the population, albeit an African language, in contrast to, for example, English, although we could also discuss, the sort of English as an African language as well. So I think there are interesting discussions there about power and access, about equality ultimately, and the kind of decolonial. So if you think of the very much immediate post-colonial era, so I talked about the 60s, a real emphasis on state building and national unity, which really is very inspired by colonial approaches. Why might you want to have national unity? The flip side being you're operating in a global context in which nation states is how you do work and how you do things, and an era of trying to take time to develop, policies and approaches, and govern and things. And I think one of the ways in which you see that in education, which I didn't talk about here, but I think it's important to remember, is that all of this is, in state schools at least, taking place against a really under-resourced educational system. So, we could talk for ages about a kind of idealized multilingual primary education with a language supportive pedagogies where, teachers are trained in multilingual approaches and everyone knows what translanguaging is. And yet the reality is that policies may be just trying to make sure that everyone who could go to school goes to school. It might be making sure that teachers get a salary. It might be making sure that there's, sanitation, access to water, food provisions at school. And I think, again, with a kind of decolonial thinking, like, it's very easy for me to, in my case, sit in the UK and think about a language policy that I think should be in place in Tanzania and practices that should be used. But I mean, that's a very sort of colonial approach to these things, where the realities are parents are saying, we want our kids to have jobs. That's your reality. That's why you're going to school. So yeah, I think lots of issues there. And again, different countries, but then within individual countries, different things happening in different regions. So back to the idea of smaller level local multilingualism, I think it's really important if we're going to try and think about kind of decoloniality at all.
Absolutely, yeah. And as you were saying that as well, I was thinking about the importance of or the opportunity of broader ideas about decolonizing to change, to the opportunity to change narratives, and change narratives that are well overdue a change as well. So and that sort of seems interesting, as well as a possibility that sort of translanguaging, not that I think necessarily that that's going to be a fix-all for everything, but I think it certainly starts from a very different place, doesn't it, and positions people in a very different way as well. So to that sense as well, to what extent kind of more translanguaging policies are sort of at the beginning a lot more honest in terms of how they understand kind of individuals and how individuals experience their own linguistic repertoires. So in that sense, again, in terms of providing access to school and encouraging people to attend schools. So if young students or older learners, whoever they are, if there's a sense that actually what they're going to be doing in school is, part of their own sort of selves and sense of self as well, actually getting into the classroom might be a slightly easier first step, against all the other pressures that are kind of being exerted on people. If you feel that actually when you get there, you're going to be forced into doing something that doesn't respect or represent who you are. Whereas I think, perhaps if there is a more of a translanguaging approach, and one where multilingualism or the discourses around kind of the value of languages changes, so that actually, people do feel that they have their own space in classrooms. So in that sense, it will be interesting, I think, to see the more documentation there are of kind of translanguaging practices, how this helps people to shift the narrative, and particularly teachers as well, and the role that they can play in that. And this is something I think you talked about too, but something we're sort of working on in our own project too, as well, the sense of, what do teachers need in order to be able to, enact policies and practices that they might well be, more interested in as well, or feel that closer represents their own language practices too. Good. Sorry, there's another great question. Thank you. So we sort of say, do we see arguments or cases of adapting local languages to subjects such as math and science as well? And I don't know if you.
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting question, because I think what happened in the past and continues to happen is an emphasis on words. Right, so okay, we now need to teach physics in Swahili, and we need to have a new word for this. And I mean, in many cases there were words for things, but this kind of focus on the extension of the lexicon. So I had this education which was all in English. I'm now going to teach in, whether it's Swahili or whether it's like, first year schooling in Bemba or Lozi or Setswana. Maybe they're not doing kind of quantum physics in grade 2, but like, these kind of more technical terms. And I think it's really interesting that we focused on the vocabulary for doing that. It's very much, this is the education, and now we need to like translate it into this other language. But what the impression that we get from the teachers, and actually this is definitely my experience of conducting research in Tanzania, is like, well, you only say, algebra or divide or something, like you only say the terms a relatively small amount of the time. The rest of the time is spent explaining what those things are, which we all then, you're paraphrasing, you're explaining, you're trying a different approach, you've got different ways of doing things, maybe you've got diagrams and things like that. So I think, yeah, absolutely, like, again, almost a kind of like linking back to the decoloniality, like, I mean, all of this knowledge and content can be taught, and can be taught in any language, and, like different modalities. And, this is knowledge that we're trying to, teachers and educators are trying to kind of get across, but also construct with their pupils, like a kind of conversation in dialogue. And I think that the idea of like the multilingual sort of approach to that, so actually I'm drawing on everything that you might know in grade 2 or grade 4. So I'm probably going to have to use something that you learnt in your English class. I'm probably going to have to use something that you learnt in your maths class. I suppose the sort of other side of that is a much more structured, okay, you've got an exam, right? And this we do see in terms of actual progress. So our project's really interested in students' experiences of school, and kind of positive experiences and negative experiences. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, if you've got to sit an exam, you've got to pass that exam to get to the next year, or you've got to pass that exam to get to secondary school. I think, that kind of very narrow idea of, well, here's a long list of words that are English for this topic, and here's a long list of words of Swahili for this topic, is only, part of the solution if it's going to help at all. So I do think, I mean, you could probably look at progression rates, and our colleague Gaston Mapunda has exactly looked at, how different schools do in standardized tests and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think my and our approach would be that, the topic doesn't matter. You're taking a sort of broad, supportive approach, and bringing in whatever resources the pupils have, and as you say, ensuring pupils bring all of themselves into the classroom, and language is one part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and this also links to a point in a comment and a question in the chat too, that the more we see a shift in how how subjects are done, if you like, or how they're sort of enacted in the classrooms, and if we see them as being sets of practices. And so in that sense, that these are kind of, whether that's sort of looking at the way in which literacy is practiced in those classrooms, or the way that language is used to kind of discuss, share, create knowledge, that in that sense it doesn't have to all be through one medium, and often in and through English, and that actually that the effect of those sort of more monolingual practices, then where languages become associated with certain types of subject, and so there they have more value. And this is sort of one of the comments in the chat as well. So that how do we count, or the importance of being able to disrupt those associations, that promoting languages or language as being something that can enable you to engage in all of those subjects, so that science can and should be done in and through a range of different resources. So again, sort of, is there a way of sort of shifting the kind of the value, or the capital that languages are seen to possess? And I think that's a really important point, isn't it? I think certainly you mentioned before as well, Colin, our colleague Colin Riley, some of the work that he's doing with other colleagues also as well around, this notion that English is an important language for people to have, but actually disrupting that, and sort of more and more information coming out about the ways in which multilingual speakers will be at an advantage, are at an advantage, and so that it's sort of disrupting that dominance or reliance on focus on English as being a language of traditionally doing these subjects. So I think this is, and this is part of it as well, I think, but in terms of also around kind of teaching materials, but also the ways in which we publish, the ways in which we kind of talk about these things as well. And this is something that we've been talking about again in our own project as well, isn't it? And sort of how we shift the ways in which language is used to kind of communicate and create knowledge.
Absolutely, and the principles that you and Colin have developed about researching multilingually, we're also thinking about publishing multilingually and having our project meetings multilingually, and going to conferences and doing multilingual presentations, and all of that sort of, even the Tanzanian context where primary education is in Swahili, you then get secondary school education and university in English. So it's really difficult not to see that as like, well, ultimately you're going towards English eventually, and that's the way you get access to higher knowledge, where you engage with research, or where you engage with like science that you do at secondary school and high school and things like that. Like, wherever your starting point is, it's still all heading towards English in that context. Which I think, we really want to disrupt and think of as like, well, that would be one language that could be part of your sort of toolkit. And as academics and people working at universities trying to do similar things. So Colin's work at on universities in Malawi doing exactly that, and sort of thinking about, okay, so you have these languages, why would you try and stop people use one language and then say, oh, but now it would be really good if you could use all three, because then you're our multilingual graduates. Yeah, absolutely, just sort of disrupting those ideas and trying to both acknowledge how messy they already are, and messy some of those long received ideas about what being an expert at something means and looks like. Absolutely, and that sort of that expertise shouldn't come at such a high cost to other languages. So your linguistic repertoire shouldn't be the cost of that. So in a sense that, is there a way that we could get to, university where maybe practices tend to be happening in English or Setswana, but along the way, it doesn't mean that you have to have only that language in schools as well. So again, that's sort of the process by which we get to different goals, that they should all, moving more towards sort of multilingual practices consistently, even if you're kind of, there are sort of, again, we come back to that sense of bounded spaces or sort of boundaries within which multilingual practices might take place. So is this a space, this might be a space where there might be more sort of, for all kinds of different reasons, a preference or a predominance of a particular language. But again, that doesn't mean that comes at the exclusion of all other things. And so if we can shift that message within education, is what I think that would be really interesting. And certainly that's certainly a discussion that teachers in the UK are having on a daily basis as well. So that these are discussions that are happening in a range of different contexts. So it's really interesting, definitely.
I don't think we have any other. I'll just scroll back through just to double check. I haven't missed anything in the chat, and as I said, apologies if I've misconstrued anything that you have written in there. But I think we've covered everything that is there, and so thank you for everyone who's been participating in that. And I think, I mean, Hannah, was there anything else you wanted to mention before we bring the session to a close?
I don't think so. Yeah, only just to say thank you very much to you for being here and for the discussion, and also to the audience for I'm looking forward to looking at the comments, but the questions are all, really interesting and very much in line with the things that we continue to think about, and thinking about how to also present and share this information in new ways. Whether that's multilingual or just multi sort of format information, and trying to think about that slightly differently. And again, thanks to Erling for having us.
Brilliant. Yes, and so on behalf of Erling, thank you for today, and for everyone for participating. Thank you for coming along, and continue to engage in this wonderful series of talks. And we look forward to seeing you again somewhere soon. Okay, thank you. Take care. Bye.